Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 15, Lesson 3, African Society and Culture. So the first thing I want to talk about is what family life was like. So first of all, they lived in rural villages, so you're probably going to have, they're going to be farmers probably, right? And they live in mud huts, basically, small round dwellings made of mud. And they usually had some kind of protective walls, especially as they got into the urban areas. The villages would build up walls around them. But even in individual homes, right, they had usually some kind of protection from animals, but it might not be walls of like mud. They might be walls of sticks and things. Okay, so what was their family like? Well, they lived in larger family groups. Meaning their extended families would live with them. So extended families means not just your parents, right? There would be grandparents, maybe several generations all living together. And in their, lineage groups, they call them, they would be, the extended families are part of a larger group called the lineage group, okay? And so lineage group is when you trace, all of you can trace back to a common ancestor. So it's a much larger family group than just an extended family. And this culture, older people have the power. That's pretty similar to other cultures we've studied. And they are expected to care for each other, and especially, as you get older. Okay. All right. So one of the things that happened was a group called the Bantu started migrating to different parts of Africa. You can see that on the map. So they were starting in Western Africa, and they moved both south and east migration. And this is happening over hundreds of years. And so it's called the Bantu migration, and they share their language and culture and technologies, actually, with other groups as they migrate. So we have a spreading of their knowledge of farming and their iron working, and they spread their language and their skills. Okay. The Bantu live in villages that are matrilineal. That means they're tracing their ancestry through your mother's side. That's unusual instead of your father's side, right? Like here in America, you take the husband's name, right? So it's a more male-dominated tracing of your ancestry. And so in this culture, it's actually through the mother's side. Okay, and the wife would still, when she got married, join the husband's family when they went to live, but her family would get in exchange basically cattle, goats, something of value, metal tools, for the loss to her family. All right, so education is the responsibility both of your own family and of all the other villagers. So they would all try to educate the kids and make sure you have the skills you would need to live a good adult life, and also to learn about the history of your people. Most of that was told through an oral history, right? Telling stories down generation to generation. Remember we talked about the griots before? That was like their job, being like the storyteller. And these stories would be things to make you a better person, right? So proverbs, right, with lessons, or other lessons about life. Okay. All right. African women, their job, as in all the societies we've talked about pretty much, right? Wife, mother is the main thing. The men, of course, are going to have more of the power and more of the rights and things like that. So it's very similar to other things. But what they did notice, if you had visitors come, you might see some differences. Like, for instance, women could serve as soldiers in some of the armies in Africa, and that is pretty uncommon, right? Also, they had some African women as rulers. Here are two famous examples in the 8600s. Queen, let's see if I can say her name, Dahia, let's see if I say it right, Dahia, and then Al-Kahina. And she was pretty famous because she led her army against the Arab invaders who had attacked. And so she got pretty famous for that. And then the second one, Queen Nzinga, she governed in the southwestern Africa, and she spent 30 years trying to fight off the Portuguese who kept invading and trying to resist her people being taken for the slave trade. We're going to talk about the slave trade in just a minute. All right, so we mentioned before that the African slave trade, right? Slavery has been throughout the world since pretty much the beginning of times, right? And so the Africans did it to each other. It's not just a white thing, of course, right? It was the Europeans who end up, bringing them to America and making it a huge business. But anyway, the Bantu warriors would raid other villages to get captives that they could use for laborers or as soldiers or servants. And if you were captured and forced to serve, there would be possibility of maybe you getting your freedom if you could pay off, the person who caught you. Also, they would trade you away, maybe, right, as a commodity. And there were some ways you could get out of it. Like if you married a free person, then you could possibly be freed also. So there are some ways out of it. Interesting. Remember, we talked about the Muslim word coming in. The Quran actually bans the enslavement of Muslims. So Arab merchants, right, had to be careful. They couldn't buy Muslim Africans, but they were fine with buying non-Muslim Africans. All right. And so they would come and trade goods and just make sure they were non-Muslim Africans. And so when the Europeans started coming into Western Africa and trading, they realized this was a great market for getting enslaved Africans. And so they started trading, giving European guns to other African groups that would go and use those guns against other Africans and bring them to sell them as captives to the Europeans. All right, so the European slave trade, the Portuguese were the ones who really made this huge. At first, the slaves were used in Portugal as laborers, and then in the Atlantic, they have some islands there that the Portuguese have settled that are really great for growing sugarcane. So they made huge sugarcane plantations. And of course, growing sugarcane needs a lot of labor. So they use slave labor, right? That would be cheaper than paying higher wages to other people. So they used slaves, and so that encouraged more slave use and buying by the Portuguese. And as that grew, then they eventually also started trading them other places. You can see in the map, going over to the Americas, right? And then wherever they needed more slave labor, so wherever there were sugar plantations or tobacco plantations, rice, cotton, those are things that need a lot of slave labor. So you can see on the map where those were. All right, and then we always talk about the contributions to art of a culture. So first we're going to say that, there's been a lot of evidence of art throughout the years. The earliest ones we've found, of course, are rock paintings. If you remember way back in the beginning, how Africa was really like the beginning of where life started, right? In its ancient times, there were rock paintings on rocks of what life was like, hunting animals, things like that. Also, wood carving became quite big. Masks, there's a lot of African masks in their art, and they thought that these masks gave spiritual powers. And also they would make statues for religious purposes. So wood carving was big. Also metalworking, bronze and iron statues. There's some famous metalworkers in Benin. And so there's lots of different forms of art. Then music is one of the biggest things that I think of when you think of culture of Africa. They would express, of course, religiously, right? Like there's in all religions, most religions, I guess, there's a music component. Also, the Africans would use it as a way to keep pace and make their boring everyday tasks easier and to keep pace. So they had music, drums, things like that to keep the pace. And then also they did a call repeat. One person would kind of sing a line and then the other people would sing it back. And so that's something that kind of came when the slaves were brought to America. You heard those same things happening when they were out in the fields picking cotton or whatever. They would sing those songs and so those songs were often of like hardship, right, of wishing that they could be free, and that's going to lead to the blues. And there's also spirituals, or these gospel songs that are, adding a religious component. Often these spirituals, they sounded like Christian songs because that religion was forced on them as slaves. But also then often if you listen closely, there are hints about how you could maybe escape to freedom. They talk about swimming in the river, and they maybe were really telling you that, that's the direction to go to get to freedom, to cross over the river. So there's things like that. And then really quickly, we're not going to go into it right now, but over time, right, those, the blues, other famous music grew directly from the African experience. So ragtime, jazz, rock and roll, and rap are some examples that are famous throughout, right? Very big impacts from the African world. And then dance was also something that if you ever see, videos of Africans in Africa, you always see them dancing in a circle, right? And chanting and drumming, right? So that they believed that there was a communication with spirits part of it. Also, they had dance as part of their rituals for marking important parts of their life, like for when a boy or girl became an adult is one example. Okay, also storytelling was also really big, and which we mentioned earlier. And they had, like others, cultures, a lot of stories with famous heroes and things, right? Telling them, the appropriate way to act and giving them hope, things like that. Oh, and the picture on the side is called kente cloth, which is also a famous kind of an artwork in Africa.